Vestiges remain today. Thousands Klugei whisper. Anger is victim in disguise. It eats at your soul like cancer. So be warriors of light, peace, and forgiveness. Huaji lanas, Huaji lanas, home of Tisquanaya, they sow while still
Hello, and thank you for joining us for episode 6 of In Our Midst, people and organizations making positive change in our community and in the world. I am your host, Phil Rosner. In this episode, I am very grateful for the opportunity to talk with Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson. Terri-Lynn was born on Haida Gwaii and is a member of the Raven clan from the Haida Nation. She is an Indigenous and environmental lawyer who was named the 2020 winner of Canada's Top 25 Most Influential Lawyers in the category Changemaker. Up against hundreds of qualified nominees, her legal work for the Haida Nation shone through as some of the most impactful and compelling in Canada. Terri-Lynn is also a singer, recording artist, and author. Her prime focus is to preserve Haida laws and culture through her activism, music, and art. Please join us now for my interview with Terri-Lynn Williams-Davidson. Good morning, Terri-Lynn. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Good morning, Phil. Thank you for having me.
Terri-Lynn, I understand that you were born and raised on Haida Gwaii. Please could you tell us about your upbringing and how your early experiences as a young person helped form the path you took as an adult?
Sure. Yes, I was born and raised in Haida Gwaii. My home community is the village of Skidegate, and I spent all of my time there until I moved away to go to university. And our life was quite simple. In the village of Skidegate, it was a very small community at the time, maybe about 500 people. And a lot of our diet was from the land and sea around us, mostly from the ocean. My mother was a homemaker and my father was a fisherman. And before my time, he was also a logger in the wintertime. But we spent time out on the water with him on his fishing boat. We spent time going down to Guayhanas. And my time with my mother was spent gathering medicines from the forest and gathering food from the low tide area. And through them, they fostered a deep love of Haida Gwaii, and my father fostered a deep love of singing. My father was a singer, and he loved to sing songs that Frank Sinatra sang and others like that. And my father was a connection to singing, but my mother was a connection to Haida knowledge. My father went to residential school, and so that early knowledge and the grounding in Haida knowledge was taken away from him. So I got that from my mother, the connection to Haida knowledge, and her mother and her grandmother did not go to residential school. So my grandmother was a song custodian for all of the songs of the different clans in my community. She lived until she was 109. I knew her until I was about 5 years old, and I loved her very much. And I loved to spend time with her and hear her songs. She inspired other singers like my cousin Gujao, who was a previous president of the Haida Nation. And so my father's love of music and my mother's knowledge of Haida culture and medicines and all of that kind of came together in what I wanted to do with my life. I think my mother wanted to be a lawyer. And so I guess when I was in grade 5, I set my vision on being a lawyer. But really, my true love has always been singing. And I watched a lot of destruction of the environment in Haida Gwaii growing up. And I knew that the basis for Haida culture is really Haida Gwaii. And so I really became motivated to want to protect Haida Gwaii, to ensure that Haida culture and music and knowledge and all of the things that I had learned growing up would still be there for the next generations. And so that was why I went to law school. I actually spent time traveling through 11 states at one point in my life and saw Indigenous grandmothers taking arms to protect their land from uranium mining. But it was also against their own community. And so I knew that there was a need for someone to be an intermediary between the leadership and between the people of the land to ensure that all interests were protected. And that was actually when I decided to go to law school and to become a lawyer.
Okay, so there wasn't any particular incident that led you to decide on a legal career. It was kind of all the different aspects that you've just mentioned. Is that correct?
Yes, but one of the key moments was I was in law school and was completely, as often happens to Indigenous lawyers, very disappointed at the extent of the laws that have existed against Indigenous peoples throughout time, and the whole legal system that has legalized dispossession of Indigenous peoples' rights in Canada. And I didn't really see how that would change. And so I thought I would not become a lawyer having completed law school, except for a case that the Haida Nation had filed in 1996, and it was against Weyerhaeuser, McMillan-Bloedel, the logging interests in Haida Gwaii for a quarter of the land base of Haida Gwaii. And that work and working on that file and then ultimately succeeding in that litigation affirmed for me the need to continue as a lawyer, and that there was a place to protect Indigenous knowledge vis-a-vis the legal system in Canada.
Terri-Lynn, as Chief Legal Counsel for the Haida Nation, have you had a prime focus since you took on the role? And if so, what would that be? I know you've talked a little bit about it already, but could you please elaborate a bit more?
Right, certainly. The first case, as I mentioned, was the Tree Farm License 39 case protecting old growth cedar on Haida Gwaii and affirming in Canadian law the right, the responsibility for the Canadian government and provincial government to consult and accommodate Indigenous peoples in any sort of developments, even though we haven't completed litigation and even though we haven't negotiated a treaty. So the important thing for people to know, and nowadays most people do know that, is that the Crown, the Queen's representative in British Columbia and Canada, did not negotiate treaties with most of the people in British Columbia. So the Crown hasn't really secured its title for that reason in British Columbia. And so early in those days, when we were bringing the Tree Farm License 39 case, we also filed in 2002 an Aboriginal title lawsuit. Most of my time is spent on that litigation, and the object of that litigation is to prove Haida title to the lands and surrounding waters of Haida Gwaii. It's a massive undertaking involving experts and hundreds of thousands of documents and getting that digitized and part of a database that we would rely upon at trial. And of course, getting the evidence from the elders and the people. In the course of that, preparing that litigation, there have been other smaller cases that have arisen, such as seeking and obtaining an injunction to stop the opening of a herring fishery when the herring stocks in British Columbia and especially in Haida Gwaii have been threatened for a long time and can't support a commercial fishery. We also engaged in, along with many other Indigenous peoples and environmental organizations, litigation to stop the Enbridge Northern Gateway pipeline project. And in that litigation, much of our win was based on the Haida tree farm license case that people call the Haida case and the duty to consult and accommodate. So it's pretty much every kind of issue that might have legal consequences for the title case requires a legal review to ensure that the title case is not compromised. The title case has not gone to trial yet, where we're in preliminary, still preparatory steps, even these many years after filing it in 2002. I see one, and just because I know I've been going on for a while here, I see one of the key advantages of Indigenous peoples bringing litigation is to incorporate in common sense principles that really should be present in Canadian law but aren't. In the Delgamuukw and Chilcotin litigation, the Supreme Court of Canada articulated what they call an inherent limit. It's really a sustainability limit. We shouldn't be using lands and we shouldn't be taking resources if we're going past the sustainability limit. And so it's that kind of common sense principles that are not present yet in Canadian law and that need to be incorporated. And the advantage of working with Indigenous peoples and bringing this litigation is to achieve that sustainability limit.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to deviate just a little from the law aspect. I'm really curious about the Haida language. As we all know, many Indigenous languages have been lost. Is the Haida language still active and flourishing?
The Haida language is still active, and there are great efforts to ensure it continues. But it is, according to the UN classification of languages, it is critically endangered because there are so fluent speakers under the age of 50. So it's for that reason that I am committed to making music in the Haida language, even though I am not fluent myself. I think it's important to keep that music alive and to keep touching people with that language. I believe that the language contains concepts and sounds that help us to see things differently and help to see the world differently. That I want to ensure it reaches people through the music that we create.
Okay, thank you for clarifying. Could we now shift to your other passion, Terri-Lynn, the one through which we actually first met, that being your music? So you've mentioned that you were brought up with singing and music in your family, and I know that you have worked with a number of musicians, and most recently with Bill Henderson and Claire Lawrence, on which they collaborated with you on your 2017 release, Grizzly Bear Town. I'm curious as to how the connection with Bill and Claire came about.
Yeah, so I'll just take a step backwards first and say that my early work in the music was very traditional and in potlatches and feasts on Haida Gwaii and singing songs that are hundreds of years old and only that. And I really wanted to ensure that that this incredible music was available for young singers and others interested in Haida culture. So I worked on a project with the Haida Gwaii Singers Society to collect all of their archival recordings and release them in a box set. And I worked with a composer, Bruce Riddell, who helped bring that project along. And he brought in Bill Henderson to be the sound engineer for one of the box sets, which involved the members of the Haida Gwaii Singers Society. So my husband, Robert Davidson, his brother, Reg Davidson, Gujau and Marianne Jones and I. And so we wanted to also show that these songs are not just archival pieces, but are living pieces. And so we produced a box set of contemporary renditions of those songs. And that was my first introduction to Bill Henderson and working with him. So my next album was a marriage. It was called New Journeys, and I worked with Bruce Riddell, and we brought together classical arrangements with Haida songs. And then when it came time to me thinking about another album, as it turns out, there was a fundraiser to raise money for musical instruments for the schools in Haida Gwaii. And Bill Henderson was being honored at that event for his work in the music industry. And they asked if the people who were performing at the benefit concert would find ways to work together and collaborate on performance. But really, nobody wanted to collaborate with the Haida singer and really couldn't get their head around how they would produce music with the Haida music. And Bill was one of the ones who was willing to do that. He'd spent time working on the box set and had familiarity with that work and was keen to do that. And so we met and we tried. He identified 2 songs that he thought would work from my previous album, New Journeys. But then he said, I think we should involve Claire Lawrence. And so the 3 of us spent a couple of hours together and worked out 2 songs and performed at that benefit concert. And we really enjoyed what we did in creating those 2 compositions that are on the Grizzly Bear Town, Have a Light Heart on Your New Journey, and Peacemaking Song. And so we said, we like this so much, let's record an album. And eventually we got there, and then we worked on creating other music for Grizzly Bear Town.
That's great. I know that the pandemic has made it really difficult for musicians everywhere, but do you have any new musical projects in the works that you're thinking about for the future?
Yeah, I have been working on composing a couple of new songs. We were just starting working on those new songs when the pandemic hit. We also wanted to work on a solstice album rather than a Christmas album. And that has all kind of been on hold with COVID and trying to figure out a way that we can rehearse together virtually, given the latency with Zoom and all of that. So at some point, I hope that we can return to working together.
Oh, that would be great. You're also the author of the 2017 book, Out of Concealment, Female Supernatural Beings of Haida Gwaii. Please, could you tell us about what led you to write this book?
So let's see. I have been really fascinated for the last decade or so with supernatural beings. And supernatural beings are, some people might call them mythical, but they are the beings that appear in all of the Haida narratives. And there is an era of supernatural beings, and then human beings came. And over time, the supernatural beings became less visible in the narratives and in our life. I grew up hearing some of the stories from my parents and learned about some of the supernatural beings. And as I worked through some of my academic studies, I really felt it was important for the supernatural beings to have a greater presence in our daily lives and our thoughts about how we see the land and sea around us. Some of that is reflected in Grizzly Bear Town in the spoken word for the cycle of the supernatural beings, or the canoe song, where I say that, or I'm trying to present this idea that the supernatural beings were once in their era and their realm, and then they eventually became the land and sea around us. So certain mountains and reefs and places on Haida Gwaii were once supernatural beings that are now embedded in the landscape. And I felt it was really important for this idea that the environment around us has personhood. The environment is not inanimate that you can always take, but if I would treat you differently, if I knew that you were a human and that we need to establish a relationship with each other. And so this really came from my work as a lawyer, but there are limits to how you can convey that at law. And so for 4 years, I worked on this project of creating the images that would depict the supernatural beings. For the art behind me is my husband's art, Robert Davidson, and my late stepson, Ben Davidson, and they've often portrayed supernatural beings. And so we've grown up seeing these abstract representations of supernatural beings, but we can't visualize what they might look like if they were to appear in front of us today. And that was the object of Out of Concealment. I wanted to write an album about supernatural beings, but in order to write the music, I needed to visualize it. And so that led to working on the images for Out of Concealment. And they were so, I felt touching, and others said around me that it should be written about too. And so I worked on the book and the writing of the book and the images and the music at the same time, and they both were released in 2017.
I'm also intrigued about the oracle cards. Could you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, and I believe that these supernatural beings should have guidance for us every day. They come with incredible messages. For example, Foam Woman, which is one of the songs on Grizzly Bear Town. To write Out of Concealment, I look to what lawyers call natural law, or Indigenous lawyers call that that body of law where you actually look at the environment and see what the biological functions are telling you, and out of that comes laws. So I looked at foam, and there's this incredible narrative where Haida people who belong to the Raven clan came from Foam Woman, and she rose out of the ocean and gave birth to the ancestresses of the Haida clans who are Raven. And then all the Raven clans came from her, or most of the clans. But I thought about what foam is biologically, and it happens when the ocean swirls around and there's protein in the water, and the protein leads to foam on the surface of the water. And I thought that we were that protein in the ocean that was swirling around, and out came human beings. And if that's the case, then we are one and the same. The ocean contains our DNA, and our DNA is in the ocean, and we're all interconnected. And so that allowed me to look at the legal principle of interconnectedness and what role that has in ecosystem management and governance. So that's one example of a supernatural being that I thought had daily messages for us about our need to take care of the oceans, because we come from the oceans. And the Out of Concealment is a beautiful book, and it's quite dense with the oral narratives, but I wanted a way for people to have daily interaction with the oracle cards. And so that was the idea about creating the cards, so that people had hands-on working with the supernatural beings and helping them be more present in our daily lives.
Right. And I understand that you have also co-written a children's book?
Yes, I worked with my stepdaughter. She's an incredible educator. She has a PhD in Indigenous literacy, and she adapted Out of Concealment for a children's audience. And really, it was important to me to do that book, because one of the reasons for writing Out of Concealment was so that children would also grow up learning more about them than they currently do. I see kids playing, like my own grandchildren and other children, playing with Disney dolls and princesses and these beings with magical powers, but our supernatural beings have those magical powers too, and I'd like them to be children to be interacting with them early on. So anyway, I worked with two artists who and again, I like to explore this idea of reconciliation and people from very different backgrounds coming together and building relationships and creating something beautiful, like Grizzly Bear Town and like New Journeys. And so in Magical Beings, the children's book, I worked with two artists, one who created the background, who had great familiarity with Haida Gwaii. She wasn't Haida, but also an Indigenous artist from across Canada in a completely different place. The two of them worked together to create the images that depicted the same images in Out of Concealment, but in a way that children would gravitate towards. We're just working right now on a coloring book for children, again through Heritage House Publishing. with activities that would, again, like the Oracle deck, allow kids to work on hands-on activities to learn more about the magical beings, the supernatural beings of Haida Gwaii.
Nice. Well, this has been a really wonderful opportunity to talk with you today, Terri-Lynn. So thank you again so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me, and thank you for the great work that you do.
Home of Tisquanaya.